every time I walk into a room. Yeah, Scott Rigby. Hello, everybody. Like Dan said, we're both two of the 7, I think, maintainers of Open GitOps, this a CNCF sandbox project, which is overseen by the GitOps working group, a CNCF working group underneath the app delivery technical advisory group within the CNCF. Also, a lot of CNCFs in that sentence, but yeah. So I also, I have, like I said, I'm a Flux maintainer, a Flux community maintainer, largely. I'm also a Helm maintainer, and I do a lot for the Helm project, or in most areas within the Helm project, along with another crew of like really amazing people. And I also work on the Weave GitOps open source project. So that's kind of a new one there. But also just hello, everybody.
Yeah, and that's actually maybe an interesting place to start is the open GitOps project at Weave, which is a little bit different than Flux. And is that the UI project, or what's the difference there for people? I'm not familiar with it, so.
Right. Yeah. So all right, geez. WeaveWorks marketing folks, don't kill me. I think what I would just normally say, I'm excited about personally is that there's this project called Weave GitOps that is a UI for Flux, and it's subproject Flagger, Flux's subproject Flagger, and other tools in the ecosystem that play well with Flux. Essentially, a product or a project, an open source project that's free and open source for GitOps. I'm excited because even if I don't necessarily need to use it myself, I think it's really good for a tool to have a UI. It's one of the things that I've really liked about the Argo project for all this time is that it also has a UI. Argo is a bit different there. It's got.
Sorry.
Oh wait, we should record it, yeah?
Well, I think Twitch is recording it anyway, but it just occurred to me I should have a backup. So sorry.
Oh, good. Okay. Sounds good. Yeah. So for example, it's really I'm excited because Flux is now on a par in that area with people who want to visualize what's going on in the GitOps, like with their GitOps setup. So that makes me feel happy. And it is an enterprise. There is also an enterprise offering too. It's very similar to something like Grafana that pairs really well with Prometheus. Grafana's company, and it's free. It's free and open source, but also you can have an enterprise features for big projects or big companies.
Gotcha. Okay, very cool. So I actually was thinking, and we'll come back to that. And I think today we'll talk about just the state of GitOps, what's going on with it. We'll talk about the Open GitOps project and introduce people to that. And before we kind of launch into that, I was thinking today about when I first met you. And Scott and I actually kind of go back a long ways because Scott used to work. Is this okay if I share?
Sure. Yeah, it's on my LinkedIn.
Is that all right? It's on your LinkedIn, so I assume it's okay.
Yeah.
But Scott was working at NBC, and I think he was working with like Telemundo and all of the like NBC Universal, all of the Spanish language channels, especially. And you were building a lot of the internal systems that people were using. So you were big into Kubernetes. You were at the time, I think you were already contributing to Helm. And,
yeah.
Right? Yeah.
Yep.
And we got together and started chatting because we were planning to open up. I think we had just hired Josh Jalitsky, and we were opening up Chart Museum and a hosted Chart Museum as part of CodeFresh. And so we got together and chatted over that. And then, we kind of became friends because we got along well, and we liked each other's tech and the way that we approach things. And I got pretty involved in the Helm project for a while and was doing a lot with that project. And then as Argo came online, I kind of faded away from Helm. Something that Karina from Red Hat never lets me live down. Every time I see her, she brings it up that she says you left Helm for Argo. But
yeah, you were at a bunch of the meetings, and like you like really had a lot of a lot of things to say and a lot of like it was really good because from a code fresh perspective, code fresh had been integrating with Helm for that time. So it's like, hey, we're an end user, ultimately like an end user company, I guess you could say, or at least a user of Helm. And so that was really a great perspective to get. And I, at that time, right, so I was principal software engineer at NBC Universal, and I was basically moving from working on one television network at a time as a tech lead for that television network for the back end, the APIs and stuff like that. So we had separate platform teams. It was very siloed, but what ends up happening is, if you're the tech lead for a team, you're responsible for all the workflow, the entire SDLC, and the whole software, the whole software development life cycle, and not just production, right? So through that process, in order to make that more consistent, Kubernetes was a big interest of mine at that time, and it was a lot younger. It was younger then, so that was very interesting. And that's what led me into Helm, because I was like, oh, I'm into applications. I'm into things like package management. What does Kubernetes have for that? So that was, at that time, that was Helm, and it still is the most popular way to go about it.
Oh yeah. Oh, no doubt, it's the industry standard. I mean, everybody uses Helm by far.
Yeah, and I mean, there are to be fair, like putting my Helm hat on, there are other packaging formats for Kubernetes that have really good things to offer too. So, but yeah,
if we have time, we'll probably come back to Helm, because there's been a lot of discussion about this recently that's interesting, but kind of going forward. And so that was kind of like, I don't know, 4 years ago, something like that we kind of met and started hanging out. And then fast forward a little way.
There might be one other anecdote.
Yeah, sure.
Can I mention one other anecdote?
Yeah, please.
So there was a time where Dan's wife and I might have been working on a script for a show that has something to do with me working for the Telemundo network, or tech lead for the Telemundo network, and working with the folks down in Miami, and just like the fact that the entire
I don't think you two finished a spec script.
We didn't.
We started working the plan and some of the characters and the arc and stuff. It was a really cool idea. I don't think we should spoil it, but if anybody watching this wants to get a spec script on a really interesting TV show that Scott and my wife worked on, let us know in the chat, and we'll make it happen. Yeah, my wife does some comedy writing and wanted to write for TV, or still does.
But yeah, you were saying so sorry, I just wanted to add that before we completely skip that part, but like fast forward.
Well, yeah, okay, so fast forward as we got into, I think it was, I want to say it was like 2020, and the conversation around GitOps, it started kind of originally, the term was coined by Alexis Richardson, who is the CEO over at Weaveworks. And there were some initial, there's a lot of initial work that was done at Weaveworks around GitOps and what it should mean. And around this time, we were getting into GitOps because we'd been working on the Argo project, and we helped get into the CNCF, and we were helping move it along the graduation path and contributing and stuff. And that goes back to 2018, 2019. I can't keep track of it anymore. But anyway, we started talking about, like, wouldn't it be really cool? And this is at CodeFresh. We started talking about, with GitOps, there's a lot of debate about what is and isn't GitOps. And it feels like what has happened to DevOps, or what has happened to any of these buzzwords, that kind of gets co-opted into meaning like anything. And so we internally started talking about, hey, what if we could create some kind of open standard, and we could align that with, a broader community and create consensus, and then have people work together around this thing. And I actually started like looking at recruiting people onto this, and I paused for a minute and I said, Weaveworks coined this term, they really should be one of the first people that I call. And so when I reached out to Alexis, he put me in touch with Daniel from Weaveworks, and he was like in the middle of the exact same thing. And he was like,
yep, there was the Google Doc with this. Yeah.
Yeah. Yeah. He was in the middle of the exact same thing. He had already got, I think GitHub was already on board. And so we jumped in together, we worked on it. And then pretty soon, Azure joined and some other folks as kind of the founding members. We announced it, I think, December 2020. And
yeah, Amazon and Microsoft and yeah.
Yeah. And then I think that you at the time weren't at Weaveworks yet. I think you joined.
You had just
joined.
I had just joined, and so I was asked to help him with that. And pretty quickly, it turned out that his area of focus had shifted.
Mm-hmm.
And I was just continuing to do that. I was working with Brees, who had done a lot of the theorizing around this earlier on at Weaveworks, and
you were able to bring all of this experience from Helm governance that you had worked on, which I hadn't done anything with Helm governance really when I had been contributing, more casually to the project. But you brought all that experience of governance to the project and really helped us formalize everything. And so the whole project really took shape as you joined and became something where we had a structure. And that was something that you really spearheaded. So I was actually curious, and we've never talked about this, but I was wondering if GitOps is what drove you to Weaveworks in the first place, and what was the inciting incident that made you realize, like, oh, GitOps is the future. That's something that's important. Like, that's what we need to go to. So, like, I was curious how that happened before, and we were kind of talking at the time, but I don't remember having that conversation with you. So I wonder.
Yeah, no. In fact, I had exactly when we had been chatting before all this time. I really there was never a conversation about GitOps that came up, because I think that was something that, as you were talking about with the timeline of CodeFresh, that was kind of like we were in different timelines when we were working together. Yeah, so I mean, as you know, when I was working, as someone who was really focusing a lot on leading teams and DevOps and so on, and also doing, I was doing a lot of the, coding and API work on my own as well, but ultimately, like, being a tech lead there, it was really important for me to make sure that all of our stuff worked properly. So that's one of the reasons I was looking at CodeFresh initially, was for CI. It was primarily for CI. I mean, yeah, CD is something that CodeFresh focuses on quite a lot too, and obviously in the GitOps side of things. But at that time, that wasn't my major focus.
Yeah,
ultimately,
sure, problem was.
That would be great. Yeah, it was the pipelines and so on, like setting up pull request environments, like way back. What was it? I want to say it was like 2016 or 2017 or something like that. I don't even know, but like it was kind of a long time ago, right? And I remember writing up the feature user stories for the pull request stuff, and making a GitHub project that could build pull request environments on top of CodeFresh. That's still out there somewhere. It's super outdated, but yeah, things like that. So anyway, those are big interests of mine, right? Is like how to actually make, reliable or more reliable, more dependable, quicker ways of allowing development work to get into production. Like, how do you actually do that? How do you get all the testing working properly? How do you get all your environments working properly? How do you really make that go well for the different teams, for the product owners, or the stakeholders or whatever of each project or piece of a project, and make sure that actually works okay. So one of the things I liked about CodeFresh is it really integrated a lot of things, and we were using Jenkins at the time.
Yeah.
So
many still are.
Right. Sure. Yeah. I mean, I was anyway, an old pre-Jenkins user, right? But in any case, doing Kubernetes, it was like, really, can we do something a bit more cloud native, right? So Okay, so here's a fast forward. So I was doing all of that. I got into working at other places, including Codecademy, and doing other DevOps specific things because I was like, hey, I'm super interested in this. At that point, I had been a Helm maintainer, a maintainer of different parts of Helm at different times. I was actually co-maintaining the stable and incubator charts repos. So I was on the charts, am still, but like was at that time on the charts team and doing a lot of work there. And
Well,
also,
this is back when there was a centralized repository for all Helm charts.
yeah, when people were installing, Helm install stable WordPress, or Helm install stable Drupal or MySQL or whatever,
And I remember that was costing like an absurd amount of cash and led to getting rid of it basically and saying everybody needs to manage their own now. And so there's a bunch of different, you can add repositories more easily. And
yeah, exactly. And the birth of like Helm Hub and then the central like project that Dan Cohn like really like his baby, like Artifact Hub project and like really we're in a much better distributed space now, not just for Helm charts, but for all sorts of things within the CNCF ecosystem. That's really great. But at that time, I was also not too long after that, I was asked to be if I wanted to be one of the Helm org maintainers, which is kind of like the top level governance side of Helm, which is what I learned a lot from people like Matt Farina, who's on the CNCF TOC now, and Matt Butcher and other people who are not named Matt, but from the Helm team. Learned a lot from a bunch of these people, about how is governance looking for projects? I mean, Helm was one of the a very early graduating project from CNCF. So we learned a lot over time, ran into some problems, and that was something that that really led me to feeling like I could bring some of that into some of the knowledge, like you said, into the GitOps working group and Open GitOps project. But what actually led me to getting to GitOps and WeaveWorks, since you asked, and to Flux, is it was GitOps. I was, and many people were like working really hard to essentially do different things that are now considered the important elements, the actual important principles of GitOps, the different methodologies. And there was a lot of debates about different, like, oh, what's the best way to do this or that? And ultimately, once I started looking into how WeaveWorks was like all the older like definitions of the principles of GitOps, there were a couple of different versions, right? But like, that's exactly what I had wanted all this time. It's exactly what I wanted. So I started looking into different tools, how to do that. And that's what brought me to WeaveWorks, is because I wasn't really specifically looking for to move anywhere, but I really wanted to contribute to the Flux project because I was just like, I love how this is architected. I'm really excited about it. The one thing I really wanted at that time was a UI. It didn't have, but still, like I was really, really excited. And so I have been talking with Stefan Prodan about different ways that the Helm integration was working and how I thought it could be better, and what I'd like to contribute, if he had any advice for me. And at some point he was just like, hey, are you looking for, do you want to work on this stuff full time? So that is what led me to WeaveWorks, yes.
That's a classic open source leads to employment story right there. I mean, that's like the dream. Like, oh man,
Yeah,
I really like
what I
this
was
hobby
doing before.
project, and now I can be paid to work on it full time. That'd be great.
Yeah, I love what I was doing before, but I mean, honestly, I wasn't spending 100% of my time on the open source side of things. I was doing a lot of different things, and I think it would be fine that too. But I'm really like excited about like what this can allow, and so that's why I moved there.
Yeah. So the standards and the home now is opengitops.dev. Anybody can go there. You can see the principles that were put together and were agreed upon by the community. We had, I think, over 99 contributors from 45 different companies. And since then, we've had more people joining. We throw conferences. We do GitOps Con. We do all this stuff. And there's lots more going on. We just added a bunch of maintainers, all these things. So one of the things that I've been thinking a lot about this week is companies that feel like they're not ready for GitOps. And it's something I kind of scratch my head about a little bit, but I've talked to several people where they're like, oh, we're not ready for that. We're traditional CI/CD, we hand roll a deployment, those kinds of things. So I wanted to just explore for a moment, like, why do we think that people aren't ready? Are they actually not ready? Or do they have maybe maybe they don't understand GitOps well enough to understand that they are ready, there'll be benefits? Because typically what I see is as people start adopting GitOps, their deployment process gets simpler, their remediations go faster, their software is more reliable, people have a true source of truth. Is it just a matter of education, or do you think that there are other things that are keeping people from adopting this today?
Yeah, totally. Right just before that, I put in, I don't know how the Twitch Zoom thing is working, but I just put in a comment about the exact contributor details.
Oh yeah,
That
I'll
you're
throw it
mentioning
into
from
the
companies and the
Twitch
people.
chat.
Okay, cool. Yeah, that's a that's just a link to the version 1.0.0 of the GitOps principles and glossary that's bundled with it. And the co-authorship is in the Git commits. So there's a lot of co-authors. The specifics of their contributions are also in Git and linked through the pull request and through the different issues that are led to that are also linked. Then the other interested parties and other folks who joined the meetings and so on are also listed there. So thank you to everyone.
Yeah. Huge thank you. I mean,
it's hard to remember
almost a
the
year
details
to come out with these principles. It's 4 principles. They're not that
Yeah,
long.
6 months.
6 months. Okay.
Yeah, with a lot of debate and for a while twice weekly and then weekly meetings. I think I missed maybe 2 of all of those, and yeah, so it was quite an ordeal. But when I shouldn't actually say ordeal, it was an interesting, important thing for folks to be aligned on, because it wasn't just the principles themselves. There was very little debate about the actual components of the principles, but there were, which pieces of each of the principles that we have now should be grouped together. Eventually, they were kind of separated into very specific and progressive principles.
Well, yeah, they started off as fairly long, and most of the work was in trying to simplify and shorten it down to just clear, crisp ideas that people would remember.
That's right. And also it may sound a little bit abstract to people who are like, so how does this relate to Kubernetes? Because it doesn't even really mention, it actually doesn't mention Kubernetes in there, or necessarily rely on being cloud native. I think it's clear that in a cloud native world, it's really only in a cloud native world that they can be fully realized, at least at this point, for what we understand about cloud native technology. But the principles are there, and and as intended to be foundational, they can really be used with various kinds of systems. And we even in the glossary explain what we mean by a system and what, et cetera. So it's something now that like many different big companies, but people representing other organizations from around the world that are very important in this area all came together on, so that there won't be continued debate, at least about what is GitOps.
Yeah, and actually, I would say, I mean, before we return back to the topic of like why people might not think they're ready, but I think that in that effort, it's been largely successful. Last year, I remember having a lot more conversations with people who were saying, oh, I am doing GitOps because I do Terraform apply from my personal machine, and it brings up the entire planet. And it was like, okay, you're like part of the way there. I don't have those conversations very often anymore. I don't see people saying, no, this is what it really is. I don't really hear that debate anymore. Instead, it's, oh yeah, this is where we're at in our journey, or this is what we've accomplished so far. We have these things still remaining. But I don't hear people saying like, we're doing GitOps full stop, and they're not even like, I think it's been largely successful at that.
Yeah, it does seem that way.
So far.
Yeah, it does seem that way. Yeah. But yeah, so why people are having a hard time, or like what roadblocks might be in someone's path, or what
Yeah, like
challenges
why
they
do
face.
people maybe think that they're not ready? And sometimes, like, I mean, I have some thoughts on this too, but like, you know,
Mhm.
sometimes I hear people talking about, oh, like our company is different. And I'm like, oh, okay, like, what does that mean? What does it mean that your company is different, that you can't do GitOps? And you know, generally it has some sort of, it's not really a, it's not a process thing from the perspective of that they couldn't achieve it. It's that some other group mandates a part of the process that they haven't figured out how to fit in. So I don't know, like, yeah, what would you go into?
Yeah, I mean, it's, like GitOps really grew out of, I mean, it really is an important extension of DevOps, right? It isn't the same thing as DevOps, but it's built upon decades of best practices, various different methodologies, right? And some of them, and they can be summarized very neatly, now. But the very beginning of GitOps is really, the very first principle that the different components of your system, including even ideally everything required to reproduce that exact same system, like from soup to nuts, really, including who should have access to that, what are the security policies, who are the, yeah. What is the networking like, right? What are the various rules around that? And what application should be running on it? What different kinds of tools should be there? What kind of tenancy should be happening, whether it's a Kubernetes model
So
or
it's just a
something
matter
else.
of kind of being overwhelmed with decision making.
Yeah, and you should be able to, the first principle of GitOps is that you should be able to declare all of that in some kind of in some form of manifest. When we're talking about a Kubernetes world, then yeah, we're talking about Kubernetes manifests, or manifests that aren't for things just inside of Kubernetes, but things that can, Kubernetes controllers can still read through the kube API. So custom resource definitions, et cetera. One way or the other, or some other kind of manifest, right? Like the Terraform controller, right? Like maybe you can have them declared in Terraform. In fact, you can for a lot of things, right? So it's just that that everything can be declarative. And so I think that's one of the biggest hurdles that people first start with. And there's no surprise that that's the first principle, because certain systems that are mandated by people in siloed environments, where you have a platform team and you have maybe a cloud team, I don't know, or you have, et cetera, like just an ops cave. And then you've got, your applications teams who kind of have to like pester the ops people, or like bring them gifts of whiskey and chocolate or whatever to, like entice them to like make up a new environment for you, or do whatever, install some tool. Whatever it really has to do with DevOps. I think it has to do with the entire system of how an organization, like what is their communication structure like, and their and the actual
Yeah.
technology then reflects that, and vice versa, right?
One of the,
yeah.
Oh, well, one of the things that I've seen a lot of is people struggling to do CI in the first place, and to do CI well enough that
Oh,
they have
really?
confidence in their artifacts being ready to be deployed. And
Oh,
so
sure.
there's this
They're not doing.
hesitancy that I see.
Mhm.
Well, yeah, there's this hesitancy I see very often where people are essentially saying, I like the idea of having everything in Git, but I want to have manual control after it's added to Git in case I don't want to deploy it. And its question is like, well, why don't you want to deploy it? Why did you put it in there? And they're like, well, because I need to look at it first and make sure. And it's like, okay, why is that? And it's like, well, because I don't actually have a good process to validate this stuff before it even gets into the repo. So I do notice that, like, shockingly, we are like 20 years. CD's been around a long time, but people still
Yeah.
really struggle with that, especially when you're dealing with microservice environments and trying to do integration testing across all this mesh of services and stuff. So that I see that as being very common.
Absolutely, yes. So I guess maybe I was being a little too abstract, but I just wanted to kind of start at the base for a second because it's really
Yeah,
the
no, you're
problem
not
of
wrong.
DevOps that, yeah, I think it's really the problem of DevOps that makes it difficult for folks to get into GitOps in the first place. If you can't actually get to the point where you have any kind of a system where everything you do can be, where you can declare your desired end state, rather than having to like have just like step after step of scripting and then various kinds of like duct tape and spit and string and paper, toilet paper mache and whatever it is that's holding a system together, like an actual workflow for like, if you can't have that, then you can't get any farther with the GitOps principles really. But I think like you were talking about like the CI/CD approach. Most places I've ever talked to, connected with, are doing some form of CI/CD. It's usually just all smashed together. It's because, like, as you mentioned before, I think you've used the term like traditional CI/CD in the sense that, your delivery happens as part of your continuous integration pipelines.
Part of a pipeline.
At some point there, if you get to a certain point, you either have like a setup where you then have a manual gate to press your go ahead and do it in Jenkins, or it just goes, if you even got to the point where it's continuous delivery, it's all part of a CI pipeline as well. So in order to deliver anything, you need to run all your tests again, all your other things again. Also, yeah, the confidence might not be high because for a lot of people, and I understand this, they're moving at the speed of business. It's rather hard sometimes for people to figure out how to justify giving developers enough time to write tests for everything that they do.
Yeah.
It's and to depend on those tests. But I don't think any of those things in themselves are actual blockers from GitOps. I think they're perceived blockers, because I noticed how you asked me that question. Why do people think they're not ready for GitOps, right?
Yeah, it's not necessarily what's actually blocking them, because maybe
Yeah.
nothing is really blocking them.
Yeah, I think like on the road to GitOps, you can really step through. I think the place to start is to step through existing automation processes. I would like to say CI, but maybe there's automation that's not just CI, right? And there may be some companies have CD processes that aren't part of their CI/CD pipelines, but they're different, right? Like maybe they're using tools like Chef or Puppet, maybe they're using Ansible only, maybe they're doing that combined with lots of different kinds of scripting, maybe it's a lot of it's manual. It really just depends, on the company, the project, the team. And I think the very first thing is to look at that automation and to say, hey, can I separate my delivery from this in some way? Can I at least move that part into something else, to some other tool that's better able to handle it? And through that process, generally, you're going maybe bit by bit in a strangler pattern, you know what I mean? Like maybe it's like one workload at a time, or one project at a time, or one area of your business at a time, or whatever. But as you go through the process of detangling that automation, and start setting up CD in a way that kind of uses newer tools and newer paradigms, or at least more current paradigms, connections of other older practices that have been field tested for a long time. GitOps is one of those things that's coming up on a lot of people's lips, because it's like, oh, it does give me much more reliability, at least it promises to. It does help with, shit, if my entire production system goes down, I can be back up in minutes. Oh, I can do multi-cloud now. That was like a thing that like, people were like, oh, that's just a promise that will never happen. For most people, right? And so it's like, yeah, well, now you can have a source of your source of truth in Git, and as long as you're constructing it in a way that allows you to deploy it on multiple cloud providers, you can use that source of truth for all of them. You can switch between them if you don't like their pricing, or you can have good backups, or you can do different types of, solve other problems that are region-based, speed-based, price-based, etc. And GitOps is one of those things that allows you to do that. But I think it's through that process of untangling that automation that once you start picking those pieces out, as you're working through the process, you're like, oh, this is actually a ton of scripts and files and stuff. Can I make this declarative?
Yeah, it
you do that one at a time, and already you're on the road. Yeah.
Yeah, it reminds me of years ago, there was this commercial that AT&T put out and it was like, what's the future going to look like? And it showed this man getting off the train and he goes up to a phone booth and he pulls up the phone to his ear, and then on the screen pops up a video and he's calling home and he's talking to his family. Hey, I just got into the train station. I'll be home soon. And what's hilarious about that is the idea that we'd have video chat. That's true. We would have video chat. We were going to have that in the future. That was going to happen. But the idea that we'd have payphones was completely wrong. But because at the time, people couldn't imagine a world without payphones, they had to put it in the context of payphones. And the reason that I say that this reminds me of that is I often see people who are like, oh, there's a GitOps operator that's doing synchronization, so I need to have my CI/CD pipeline trigger synchronization. And it's like, no, Neo, I'm telling you that when you're ready, you won't need the CI/CD pipeline to interact with the deployment at all. Because you've structured it in a way where you're letting the GitOps operator do its job, and you're letting the CI/CD pipeline do its job. And those are actually distinct processes that don't need to be married necessarily in the pipeline together. So like, I don't think it's bad that people start by doing that because they're extending from what they know. I don't want to like shame people for that, but it is
not at all. I mean,
not
in
the
fact, that was
destination
the standard.
necessarily. Yeah.
That was the standard,
Yeah.
it was like a kind of holy grail on itself almost, it was like, oh my gosh, we've got CI/CD and here's all the ways that it can work. And, even with Jenkins, you could do polling, right? So it's not like you can't fulfill certain versions of GitOps principles it's not like you have to have like specific tools. You don't have to have Argo, you don't have to have Flux, you don't have these various tools. They do different things, and they've been built to provide more qualities to you that have GitOps in mind.
Well, this was something that I remember we talked a lot about when we were baking the principles in the first place. When within the principles, they don't actually mention Git anywhere. It says you need to have version control, versioned and immutable. Your desired state needs to be stored in a version
and retain a full audit trail.
Yes, right. Because that's what you get if it's versioned and it's immutable, is you also then get you get history, right? And we didn't put Git in there, and we had this, I remember we had several discussions that were very hilarious about what would qualify as versioned and immutable. And it was like, well, would a Google spreadsheet count as versioned and immutable? Because it actually has versions in there and it is immutable. You get one specific URL, one specific key. So could I have that be my thing? And I remember, I think it was a few months later at KubeCon, somebody gave a talk entitled Sheet Ops, where they had defined what was supposed to be happening in Kubernetes in their Google Sheet. And then they were triggering reconciliation off of that. And the answer was, yeah, I mean, if you're meeting the requirement of versioned and immutable, so you get that audit trail and all that stuff is going to work, you can do rollbacks, then you're doing GitOps. Even if you're not using Git, you're using GitOps without Git. That's okay.
Yeah. And if you fulfill the other principles, right?
Right. Yeah. If you're familiar, yeah, you have to be doing the rest of the stuff too. Yeah. It's not enough just to put your configuration into Google Sheets. You need to also do the rest. But that was the approach with all of the principles, was to make them tool and vendor agnostic. It doesn't say anything about Kubernetes. It doesn't say anything about Argo or Flux. It's simply, these are the things that you want to achieve in order to do this. And then there's a lot of things that if you can extrapolate and build off those principles, but some of the things that I've seen where some of the content has been more successful has been in places where people are just asking questions like, okay, I'm fully bought in on the principles. How should I organize my Git repo? And Kostas did famously, like, kind of the main, the canonical source of truth on this, in my mind, on the CodeFresh blog that I hear people reference all the time. But what are some of those other things that do you think that are maybe the things that slow people down, or the decisions they need to make up front that they aren't aware of?
Well, so Pinky, Ravi, and I did a talk on organizing Git repos with a slightly different take. It wasn't so much here's the opinion on how to do it. It's depending on your tooling, and this is where the tooling does start to come into play. In this particular case, using Flux as an example, your tooling, from my point of view, well, if it's flexible enough to be dispassionate about exactly how your repos are structured, then you have a bit more freedom to migrate in patterns that work for your teams. So one of the things that we tried to show is, okay, here are some major known patterns of how to do this. In that sense, it's not too different from parts of what Costas spoke about. Let's say environment per repo. In this case, a Git repo, but environment per branch, an environment per directory, an environment per et cetera. Right. So the important thing, the important thing, I think, is showing people that at least this is what we did in ours, and we can link to it. I guess I can send that for you for the Twitch. But what it shows you is how you can move from a mono repo to a repo that's split up into different sections. How you can move Git history as well if you want to do that. How you can move from one. In the case of Flux, one customization that tells you kind of what folders to look at and so on to bring for your third principle, to bring those configurations into your runtime environment by your GitOps controllers. Excuse me, how to break those up into multiple ones so that you can pause one while you're working on another, and it doesn't necessarily stop your entire process. And then how you can reverse that process too and say, hey, you know what? We've got repos all over the place. We want to make a mono repo, or we want to make several mono repos that maybe one for the platform team, one for each app team, or et cetera. And you can do all of that without disrupting your GitOps in production. So that's kind of an interesting approach. But yeah, obviously it's a self plug because you invited me on the show to talk about it. So yeah, check that out.
Yeah, absolutely. Plug it.
Yeah, I'll ask to send you that link, and maybe you can send it later.
Yeah. I'll throw it in there. Yeah, and I think other things that I've noticed are, I want to say the word is shibboleth. That's not the right word. It's like an artifact of where you came from, but I will see people sometimes extend kind of their old world paradigms into the GitOps land. So the example that I gave earlier was people putting sync steps into CI/CD pipelines, which is oh yeah, okay, that's because that's how you used to do it. You're just swapping out the deployment step. But there are other ones with secrets or with how you handle pull requests. And the one that I was thinking of while you were talking actually was putting an environment per branch. And this is something that if you've been developing an application, you're used to Git flow. You're oh, okay, I have a branch for V1 and I have a branch for V2. And if I can have a security update, I can apply it to both branches. And that makes sense because within the application development world, they're having some long-standing branches can make sense in a lot of scenarios. But I've come to the place, and maybe you'll tell me that I'm too fanatical about it, that you should never use, that there's no reason you should ever use a branch per environment. So do you think I'm too zealous on that, and maybe I'm overlooking some great use cases?
Honestly, no. I think I have one reason why I think I like to take a look at the pros and cons of each approach. You know what I mean? Maybe it's good to be a bit more to sort of simplify high level and say never do this because maybe that is good. At least in effect. So people will be whoa, wait, should I think about this? But I do have one really important reason why it's a good idea not to do that. It's that if you're using GitOps for your infrastructure as well as for your just application development, right? Which is what a lot of people use GitOps for. People can use GitOps just for their application delivery too, but almost always, even with applications, you've got configurations, certain options, certain settings that you're not going to ever want to merge, ever want to merge from your development environment to your production environment. Like, for example, maybe, or your just one-off pull request environments, right? Like maybe you only want one replica as you're doing something just for a pull request environment, or two if you want to test something out for it.
And if
Whereas
that
your
were
production
merged
might
into
have hundreds.
production, it would be a disaster. It would be really bad. You don't want to do it.
You never, that's right, you never want to do that. Yeah, it doesn't mean that you can't have dev stage branches or whatever you want to do, but for your configurations, generally you're still going to have some type of either directories for those within that same schema, within that same tree, like file tree, and or if you use something like customized overlays or some other kind of tool that allows you to have maybe shared folders, but just different specific overlays that are different for different environments, very similar to a Helm chart that has a values.yaml, but then you've also got your production-values.yaml and your staging-values.yaml, etc. That's a way that's not, it doesn't always have to be organized by folder. It could be organized by some type of schema that allows you to, on every branch, see a difference between the environments.
Yeah,
Because otherwise,
diffing is my biggest thing for this is if I want to diff between staging and production, being able to just look at two different folders and run a diff on them, wow, that's super easy, super nice. Now, if they're in different branches, that's actually way harder. I have to check out the repo twice. I probably have it in a different subset folder, and I have to figure out that structure. And I've got lots of branches that don't represent environments. So now I'm looking at my Git structure and I'm starting to think like, okay, what's actually deployed? And I have to go through and parse every single branch to figure out, oh, is this like a deployment branch or is this just a feature development branch? So I don't like that. And then also,
I can see that. I personally don't think that, I just want to say, I personally don't think that's a, we can kind of we can debate on this for fun, but I personally don't think that's a showstopper because it's pretty common to have branches that are prefixed with deploy or something like that.
True.
But at the same time, it's still the case that you just have to manually ignore a lot of things if you're using the same file to deploy infrastructure, applications, or any other kinds of policies or whatever to one environment versus a different branch with those same files to another environment. You have
that's right. My biggest issue with it by far is cherry picking, is having to do these complex cherry pick commits between branches. And if you mess it up, you copy over the wrong values and it's just never going to work. It's never going to work as smoothly as you expect Gitflow to work as it does for just plain applications.
I could see it happening. Yeah, absolutely. I could see it happening, and especially with different kinds of automation where you're not actually using it in a traditional sense where you'd ever even see any kind of possibility for a pull request between the two. They could even have different histories, but I think even in that case, yes, you could do it, and maybe it does make sense for someone's workflow, but it's still not the same traditional branching system that someone's thinking about where they make a pull request, or where they merge in, say we're just talking about GitLab or something, merge request, pull request, whatever, but they merge in something from one of those lower environment branches to another. It just doesn't really work in this setup well.
No, and it's hard to imagine a scenario where there are lots of scenarios where it's possible and it could work, but it's hard to imagine a scenario where it's literally better than doing it like per folder or even per repo or some other thing like that. The Git branch thing, I mean,
it won't work in the same way. Let's say that it just won't work in the same way without manually ignoring a lot of things.
Yeah, and I think the reason that people do it is mostly because they're coming from Gitflow with the way that applications are developed. So it's the same thing with I've got a CI/CD pipeline, I'll tack on a sync step. Why not? It's like, okay, well that'll get you farther down the road than where you were. So that in that sense, it's good. But it's also, if you think that that's the end of the road, there's a whole lot more value you could be getting out of this. And frankly, when it comes to the level of tooling now, I find it easier to do GitOps than it is to do the alternative. Like it's more work for me to have to build and maintain a system where I'm not doing GitOps than it is to do it with GitOps. Because once I've got with GitOps, and I hear this too, I hear people asking me, I've actually had some today and yesterday, people were asking me, hey, what's the best strategy for backing up Argo CD? Now, is that not, if someone asks you, Scott, what's the best strategy for backing up Flux, does that not like make you scratch your head for a moment? Because the idea of backing it up implies that the source of truth hasn't already been defined. You know what I mean?
I know, I think I hear what you're saying. Yeah. For sure. Yeah. Right. Because hopefully if your GitOps tooling has its own separate kind of database or something that's separate from what you're storing in your versioned immutable versions, or let's say what you're storing in Git, right? Then I guess, I think that would be overly complicated, and most of the tooling that's out there does not do that. I know like an early version of Captain did that, where there was like several different sources of truth. One was a database, and so that kind of makes sense. And I'm not saying that that's bad. They've actually re-architected that entirely.
Yeah, well, that's a different, that's kind of a different tool problem. And like you said, they re-architected. But like if I go into, so I really like Argo CD Autopilot, because actually one of the things that I liked about Flux when I tried it was that Flux was very opinionated about how it should be set up and how it's structured to get repos. And it was like, okay, so I have a very clear path forward. And so this is one of the reasons that we made Argo CD Autopilot, is because we wanted to have a very opinionated turnkey approach to deploying and managing Argo CD. And so when I use Argo CD Autopilot, my repo, it creates my repo for me, it structures it for me, I add my applications, I'm rocking and rolling, I'm deploying stuff. Now, in the case where my Kubernetes cluster got deleted from the planet, I can just go into that repo and just rebootstrap it and everything will just come back up. Yep. So I don't have to have it backed up anywhere because the source of truth was Git in the first place. I think Flux operates in a similar way, right?
It does, with a slight difference from what I mean, that makes sense that was your impression, that it was opinionated. Flux is not actually opinionated. When you use the convenience bootstrap command from the Flux UI, excuse me, the Flux CLI, you will get an automated setup. Yeah, and that makes sense. And it sounds like that's a similar thing to Autopilot.
Yeah, it was something that we didn't have before. Was this
right? Yeah. You can, however, structure it any way you want. So you don't actually have to use that tool. That's just to help folks get started. And that's actually what the Weave GitOps, a corollary, I think, to what you're describing in Autopilot, is one of the things Weave GitOps offers too. It's like, hey, this is what Weaveworks tells its clients when we work with people. We've got a couple of different things like that work depending on your pattern. Here's some opinions and like some guardrails, basically, and here you go. That sounds a lot like what you're describing Autopilot as. So, but yeah, like I just wanted to like dispel that impression.
Yeah. Sorry, I didn't mean to impute Flux with maybe more than was meant. But
that's okay. It's okay.
But the way that it works,
just,
I mean, I should expect with Flux, I can go and bootstrap a repo and everything will just come back, right?
That's correct. Yeah. The Flux. So you can install Flux either manually or with different kinds of installers, or with the bootstrap command. The bootstrap command is really nice, especially when you have private repos, because it does things like it very securely creates a secret in your cluster. It creates a deploy key in your Git repository. It creates a secret in your cluster with that information securely. But yes, you're right. The effect is that Bootstrap is idempotent. You can run it as many times as you want, whether it exists on your cluster yet or not. So yeah.
So if someone were to ask you, how do I back this up? It seems like the answer would be like, oh, well, let's just make sure everything is committed and you have.
Well, exactly. I'd probably like ask them if the problem is that they don't find that their source of truth, like whether it's GitHub, GitLab, an S3 compatible bucket, OCI, Helm repository, some other source, whether they feel like that source doesn't have the same SLOs that they require for uptime. Like say, oh, GitHub is down once in a while or something like, I mean, their SLOs are pretty damn high, but let's say you needed even more nines, right? Then okay, then yes, I think backing up is a good idea in that case, but it's not so much backing up for the tool as it is a backup for your source of truth. For example, Git clones or some other automation that helps to make sure that your source is in the region that you want, or that you're using something like S3 or OCI that's connected to your cloud that can help you avoid hairpinning and paying for the costs of continuing to go and fetch a source of truth from somewhere that's not in the same region. There are things like that that I think would be similar to the conversation about backups, but I think you're totally right. There's no need for a tool, at least there's no need for a tool like Flux or any GitOps tool that doesn't have a separate database to require a backup that's separate from you backing up your own source of truth or making sure that you have the uptime that you require for your source of truth.
Yeah, Argo uses Redis as a caching mechanism. And so it is stateful. It's a stateful set, but it's not important. Like if you lost it, it'll just rebuild. So you don't need to like care about it.
Right. It's it's purgeable.
Yeah, purgeable. Maybe that should be the next principle. Purgeable. # purgeable.
I mean, unless you have nothing to purge, but yeah, that's true. Yeah, that's similar to Flux, the source controller, for convenience and to help, be as performance minded as possible. The source controller will cache things that it fetches. When in the third principle you're fetching your configurations, it'll cache those.
Yeah.
But yeah, you're right. You don't need that if that cluster goes down. Or that caching mechanism isn't shared across different instances. It's not a problem. It just needs to be recached.
So we've got, a couple minutes left, and I thought it would be good maybe to shift gears and think a little bit about where the GitOps project is going. So currently, you and I are the co-chairs of Open GitOps, of the GitOps working group.
Well, at this point, we could say the GitOps working group, but not the Open GitOps project, right? Because it doesn't really have.
It doesn't have a co-chair. Yeah. There's the GitOps working group, and there's Open GitOps, and there's technically a governance difference there, but we've just added some additional maintainers. We're working on additional conferences and things like that. What are the areas that you'd like to see the group focus on? We've got these principles out, and there's a lot of marketing to do for them. Is it more about getting the message out, or do you think that there's more work that we should be doing in content creation, or what would you like to see the project go?
Yeah, well, I've got a couple of different, a couple of different calls to action. One is around the events. The biggest event at this point is GitOpsCon. The calls to action, I mean, just going to list a couple of top ones. Really just two for now. I think CFP proposals. Choose to start connecting with people you want to collaborate with, start chatting about your topic ideas, and start writing your proposals, because it's the date hasn't opened yet. The CFP hasn't opened yet. But probably if you're already doing that for next KubeCon in Amsterdam, you're already working on your proposal, your CFP proposals for the main KubeCon. The co-located events will be a little bit later the date, like it always is. But start thinking about it. So that's I think the first call. Yeah.
And I'll add too, like I've seen there are 3 kind of subgroups starting within GitOps now. That's pretty interesting. One of them is an environmental sustainability subgroup.
Yep.
And isn't this somebody from Weaveworks that is working on this?
Well, there are people. Well, some
that started. I'm not saying it's only them. I'm heading you off, Scott, because I can hear you saying, hey, that's not just a Weaveworks thing. I know it's not a Weaveworks thing, but the idea, yes. I was trying to give credit. The idea.
Yes, Nikki from Mendel Ladaki from Weaveworks.
Yes.
Has been very active in environmental sustainability and computing. wrote some white papers on this like a year and a half ago, has been working on this pretty for quite a while before this environmental sustainability working group and then TAG came about in CNCF. A lot of other people are working on it too, but yes, Nikki has been putting a lot of effort into it and has been collaborating with William Cavan from Red Hat, from the GitOps working group, and with a number of other people. Jamie Magiera is also part of that. So really, there's a really good force of people from several different who are currently employed in several different organizations who are really working well together.
Yeah, and it'll be interesting to see what they come up with and how you can leverage GitOps to improve sustainability. I've also seen there's a subgroup proposal for GitOps ML for machine learning and bringing that to GitOps, which is something I've actually heard from outside the group a demand for, people saying, if we could figure out a way to make our machine learning more GitOps, that would be really powerful for us. And so that's a group that I see spinning up. And then there's also a security subgroup. So it seems like with those groups, we're going to see maybe some best practices, some white papers, maybe some talks, different things like that that could go around and help.
That's what folks are working on now. I don't know all, of course, you and I wouldn't know what everyone's working on, unless you all, dear audience, tell us. But show up to the meetings and talk about it, which some people do, however. And for those folks, we kind of know, that some of this stuff is being worked on, and some of it takes a little while. But yes, there's some really good research happening along the lines for the environmental sustainability. There's also the ML AI stuff. It seems to be like there's some real progress. The GitOps Media fact-checking group is another important one. That's more on the side of, this is a term in an area that's now been defined principally. What about the other best practices and case studies and use cases? These are things that still need to continue to be added. There are drafts of them, but they need to continue to be added. We want your support, but also when there's marketing team that are kind of using GitOps as a buzzword, maybe putting out ads or courses or various things that say, welcome to GitOps, or this is GitOps, and then you kind of look through them and you're like, this doesn't really match with what's now officially supported principles that are now pretty basically that are now dominantly industry wide. We're looking for, basically part of the goal of the group is to help, not to like police people, but to help say, oh, you might not know that these principles were published in a 1.0 version. Let's help you and just get you on board. Maybe you can participate in the group. Maybe we can help with some education stuff, one way or the other. That's the goal of that team, is to just try to do that fact checking and say, hey, this seems to be used kind of inappropriately here. Is there a way we could help you, or is the, there's one other call to action for GitOpsCon though. Do you mind if I mention it? Sponsors. So it's time to set up meetings with companies. Send your marketing people our way, not just me and Dan, but basically any of the people that are involved in the Open GitOps project. There's an events team. Let's get those conversations going if you think that your organization would like to help sponsor. The conversations are fairly open. We're going to be discussing how it may or may not be different in terms of sponsorship packages moving ahead. But the more we are able to do that, the better program we can get going, and the more you can see your name out there too. So
perfect. Well, those are excellent call to actions. We'd love to have more people joining us in the GitOps working group, working on Open GitOps, helping out with GitOpsCon. Definitely sponsors. We want to make sure that there's a really healthy relationship between the community and the sponsors that is going to be sustainable, is going to work for everybody, that the community is going to love, and that sponsors are going to be happy with. So they can continue to pay for those big buildings and the stages and all the talks to come in and do all that stuff. So that's an excellent call to action. Scott, any other final things you'd like to plug?
Yeah, totally. I already mentioned the Weave GitOps UI. I'm super excited about it. Try it out. Give us your feedback. I'm really psyched. Feel free to reach out to me if you have any questions about that. because again, it is an open source project, and so that's something that you're going to be seeing a lot more of. For folks that are in enterprise, you know, you could consider that type of thing as well. I think that's always good. But that's I think for the vast majority of people, they're not really going to be thinking about that. They think about the open source tools.
Yeah.
So please reach out to me for that. And if you want a demo or that kind of thing, or if you want to see any more about it. But the second thing is, the thing I'm excited about in Flux right now is OCI as a source. I want feedback on that. And like many people have been asking about this for a long time. You can use OCI repositories, basically OCI image or OCI artifacts for your source for things like plain YAML, for things like customized overlays, for Helm charts as well. And if you're using projects or controllers for Flux, like the Terraform controller, yeah, you can have your Terraform resources also stored in an OCI artifact. So it's really exciting in a way because it helps with to fix a bunch of the bottlenecks that can happen with certain types of setup, depending on how scalable your infra is. And I just think I just think it's very interesting. It's helpful for people who are mainly large organizations who are interested in governments, banks, and so on, who want to use the same security chain that they've been using for many years now for their
idea.
OCI images like Sigstore and like Cosine and all that other stuff. They can do that through the entire pipeline now with Flux, and that's a very recent development. So that makes me excited to check it out, and I'm sure you're going to be seeing that in other tools as well, because there's interest there.
Yeah, perfect. Awesome. Well, thank you, Scott. And I think we're going to close out there. This has been episode 3 of GitOps the Planet. The goal is to help GitOps the planet, like in the movie Hackers, GitOps the planet on rollerblades and skateboards, GitOps the planet to the Gibson. We're gonna GitOps the Gibson, and Angelina Jolie's gonna be there. It's gonna be a whole thing. So
shouting out of limos. And also join me and Dan. Dan, do you want to mention
Sure.
People can join us for these meetings. Others might not know
for the GitOps meetings?
Yeah.
Yes, there's an open calendar for the GitOps project. So you can find it at Open GitOps on GitHub. And there's also a Twitter handle, Open GitOps. You can find lots of information there. Follow Scott at R6BY. Rigby6 is how I always put it in my head, but I think it's just R6BY, which is a great Twitter handle. Mine is at Today Was Awesome. Of course, you can follow Weaveworks at Weaveworks. And you can follow CodeFresh at CodeFresh. And with that, we've got a great set of additional shows lined up. I'm excited to welcome more guests like Scott to talk about topics around GitOps and how we're going to hack the Gibson and GitOps the Gibson and rollerblade with Angelina Jolie. So that's what we're going to be going to in the future. So thank you so much. And with that, Scott and I are going to sign off. Thanks, everybody. Have a great week.